The 20th century. Rand, Hayek, Nozick, Rothbard, and Rawls. John Rawls. It's generally agreed among philosophers that Alistair MacIntyre more or less single-handedly revived the study of substantive ethics in the Anglophone world with the publication of his After Virtue in 1981, followed by his Whose Justice, Which Rationality, and 3 rival versions of Moral Inquiry. Much the same could be said of the contribution of John Rawls to the study of political philosophy in the Anglophone world. His 1971 work, A Theory of Justice, is generally agreed to have been the seminal work in political philosophy in the second part of the 20th century, and to have reignited the fading embers of political philosophy as an academic discipline. It may also have the doubtful distinction of being the only work in political philosophy to have been birthed through a musical called, well, what else? A Theory of Justice, the musical, which features John Rawls as the good guy, what else? And Robert Nozick and Ayn Rand as the bad guys. No surprise there either. With Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, Bentham, Sidgwick, Wollstonecraft and Marx playing supporting roles. A Theory of Justice ignited a veritable firestorm of responses, criticisms, arguments and counter-arguments, so that its secondary literature is voluminous. Rawls' work has since been criticised and commented on by almost every political philosopher of distinction. Nozick wrote Anarchy, State and Utopia, at least partly in response to A Theory of Justice. Michael Walzer and Michael Sandel wrote critiques of A Theory of Justice from a communitarian perspective. Marxists, feminists and a whole bunch of other ists have all criticised Rawls' position for a variety of reasons. For a book to produce such commentary and criticism on an industrial scale must surely constitute evidence of its greatness. Well, perhaps, or perhaps not. Ayn Rand wrote presciently in 1973, just 2 years after the book's publication, that within a few years of the book's publication, commentators will begin to fill libraries with works analysing, clarifying and interpreting its mysteries. Their notions will spread all over the academic map, ranging from the appeasers who will try to soften the book's meaning, to the glamorizers who will ascribe to it nothing worse than their own pet inanities, to the compromisers who will try to reconcile its theory with its exact opposite, to the avant-garde who will spell out and demand the acceptance of its logical consequences. The contradictory, antithetical nature of such interpretations will be ascribed to the book's profundity, particularly by those who function on the motto, if I don't understand it, it's deep. Within a generation, the number of commentaries will have grown to such proportions that the original book will be accepted as a subject of philosophical specialization, requiring a lifetime of study, and any refutation of the book's theory will be ignored or rejected, if unaccompanied by a full discussion of the theories of all the commentators, a task which no one will be able to undertake. So writes Rand. Rawls produced a slightly different version of the book in 1975, and then a more substantially revised version in 1999. Rawls' very much slimmer book, The Law of Peoples, which concerns itself with issues of global justice, was also published in 1999. Before that, Political Liberalism was published in 1993. This work addresses the problem of how people who have significantly different substantive, philosophical and religious commitments could converge on a liberal democratic regime. In 2001, Justice as Fairness, a restatement, appeared, which was intended to represent the central arguments of A Theory of Justice. An edition of Rawls' Lectures on the History of Political Philosophy was brought out posthumously in 2007 under the revealing title, Lectures on the History of Political Philosophy. The first characteristic of A Theory of Justice that will be noticeable to any reader of this classic work, and like many classics, one wonders how many people have actually read it, is that it is long. It's over 560 pages. Its second characteristic is its restrained New Englandish prose style, which even by normal academic standards makes it calm, worthy, and excruciatingly dull. It is not, at least not on the surface, an exciting book, and it may not be an exciting book under the surface either. No one has ever been, or will ever be, induced to rush to man the barricades for the cause of justice on reading this book. An early reviewer wrote, A Theory of Justice is a book which risks the fate of being much discussed but little read. Its high level of abstraction and its self-conscious circularity of argument will frustrate and at times infuriate even those who are deeply concerned with its themes. Ayn Rand asked, somewhat more trenchantly, is the theory of justice likely to be widely read? No. Is it likely to be influential? Yes, precisely for that reason. A Theory of Justice could perhaps best be described as an attempt to reconcile the first two legs of the French Revolution's liberty, equality, and fraternity. Whether the gratuitous exclusion of fraternity from the discussion is unjust is a matter fraternity will have to take up with Rawls. Rawls is essentially a new-look social contractarian. The standard model of all contract theories involves people getting together to agree on how they will conduct their affairs in common. Rawls has just such a get-together, but his one, which is called the original position, has some unusual features. The most prominent aspect of the original position is that in it decisions are to be made behind what Rawls calls the veil of ignorance. The simple yet ingenious idea here is that if, prior to agreement, we were to know our strengths and weaknesses, our characters and our particular views of what is good for men, we would necessarily be influenced by such consideration in arriving at an agreement with others who might well have very different natural endowments and very different views of the good. Behind the veil of ignorance, however, no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does he know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence and strength, and the like. Nor does anyone know his conception of the good, the particulars of his rational plan of life, or even the special features of his psychology, such as his aversion to risk or liability to optimism or pessimism. More than this, I assume that the parties do not know the particular circumstances of their own society. That is, they do not know its economic or political situation, or the level of civilization and culture it has been able to achieve. The persons in the original position have no information as to which generation they belong. Thus writes Rawls. Does anything survive this particularly severe case of collective amnesia? Well, yes, some bits and pieces. The veiled amnesiacs know the general facts about society. They understand politics and economics and psychology. Conveniently, they know whatever they need to know generally that would affect their choice of the principles of justice. There is a delightful air of arbitrariness, not to say unreality, about all of this, which should tickle the funny bones of aficionados of science fiction. Behind the veil of ignorance, we don't know anything about ourselves, our sex, our ages, our abilities, whether we are risk-averse or willing to live dangerously. But we do know all about politics, economics, and psychology. It is no criticism of Rawls' ideas, say their defenders, to point out their unreality. They are not meant to be real. They are meant to sketch a kind of thought experiment. Thought experiments generally divide people into two groups: those who think their very extremity makes them a complete waste of time, and those who think they can be useful in allowing us to test our intuitions in a hypothetical setting. I have no objection to thought experiments in principle, but I think it might be granted that the further they move away from reality, the less is their ability to provide some traction to our intuitions. One might also wonder how, if the denizens of the original position don't know what their other attributes and abilities are and what their conception of the good is, how are they supposed to evaluate the outcomes of their choices? Some such misgiving seems to have occurred even to Rawls himself. He writes, "The notion of the veil of ignorance raises several difficulties. Some may object that the exclusion of nearly all particular information makes it difficult to grasp what is meant by the original position." Just so. If Rawls's writing is generally dull and uninspiring, it must be conceded that he has an advertising copywriter's flair for a catchphrase. The original position and the veil of ignorance are striking images, but they aren't his only interesting conceptual devices. There is also his image of the reflective equilibrium. The central idea here is that we have first-order judgments about what justice consists in, and second-order principles that may or may not justify them. Reflective equilibrium is meant to be the process and the outcome of the process by which we balance our first and second-order judgments, giving absolute priority to neither. In trying to understand what a writer is up to, it is often useful to know what position he is arguing against. Reflective equilibrium is directed against those who would give absolute priority to some moral principle or set of moral principles, as, for example, Nozick does in Anarchy, State and Utopia. So, behind the veil of ignorance, what principles of justice governing rights and duties and the distribution of goods would our socially and psychologically emaciated human beings choose? Since no one knows what position he is going to occupy after the agreement, Rawls believes that the rational choice for all inhabitants of the original position to make is to adopt a kind of maximin strategy, that is, to choose principles of justice that would in some way maximize the position of the least well-off in the resultant society. Of course, this prioritizes the risk-averse. What if people are not risk-averse? There is nothing intrinsically irrational in gambling that one might be one of the better off. Rawls' seemingly neutral position, in fact, makes a substantive choice of character in prioritizing the riskophobe over the riskophile. Rawls comes up with two basic principles of justice, the first one dealing with liberty, the second with equality. The principles are ordered so that the first one takes priority over the second. The first principle of justice is that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties, compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. What kinds of liberties does Rawls have in mind? Well, the liberty to vote and to stand for public office, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and the freedom to own personal property. Is anything excluded from Rawls's list? Well, yes. The freedom to own property that constitutes the means of production is not included in this list, nor is the freedom to contract in a laissez-faire manner. Rawls's list is patently non-neutral in a significant number of ways, in what is included and what is excluded, and in the conflation of freedom tos with freedom froms, which already compromises the notion of liberty on offer here. The second principle of justice, the one relating to equality, comes in two parts. Here are Rawls' ipsissima verba. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both to the greatest expected benefit of the least advantaged and attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. The first part, Part A, is generally referred to as the difference principle. I believe it is generally agreed that the really significant principle of equality is the difference principle. Rawls, then, is advocating a kind of egalitarianism, but not a mechanically mathematical one. Inequalities can result from his principles of justice, but not in such a way as to discriminate unfairly against the worst off in society. Underlying Rawls' principles is a certain conception of desert, which it is important to lay out. Rawls believes that much of what comes to us as a matter of good fortune. Our families, our education, our circumstances, these are all matters of luck. We did nothing to deserve them. One might argue that whatever luck one might have had, still one has to do something with it to develop one's skills and talents, to work at one's education. This is where Rawls becomes radical. Our capacities to work hard are themselves matters of luck. One's very character, one's dispositions, these too are matters of luck, and the notion of desert has no application here. We should not benefit from our talents because we have done nothing to deserve them. At this point, we are approaching sheer nonsensicality. If everything is a matter of luck, then luck ceases to have any intellectual traction. Luck as a concept has significance only if it can be contrasted with what is not luck. I work for a day and receive $20. Not luck. I walk down the street and pick up a $20 bill. Luck. But if everything is luck, then the notion of desert goes out the window, and nobody deserves anything any more or any less than any other person. David Gordon writes, "If you don't deserve your talents or personality traits, what's left?" Rawls has evacuated persons of their attributes, leaving virtually nothing behind. Further, suppose Rawls is right that people do not deserve their superior abilities, that is, they do not acquire these talents by superior moral merit, it does not follow that they are not entitled to benefit from them. Why does the fact that you do not deserve, in Rawls' sense, your superior talents, imply that they ought to be transferred to society to be managed for the benefit of the least well-off? Rawls, though ostensibly devoted to liberty, winds up with a system in which society controls virtually all the important human attributes. In enunciating his difference principle, Rawls is trying to steer a path between allowing for any distributional outcome consistent with the freedom to own, produce, and contract, on the one hand, liberty, and on the other hand, requiring a strictly equal division of all production among the members of a society. That's equality. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. But the difference principle is unstable and collapses either on the side of liberty or on the side of equality. Given that all human capacities and talents are matters of moral luck, there is to be a bottom line equality in the distribution of wealth created by a community. Once a bottom line equality is achieved, however, inequalities are permitted. This is how Gray puts the argument. How can I justly bargain for more than equal share by threatening to withhold my scarce talents? It must be because I have some special claim on these talents and their fruits. But if they are considered a social asset, as Rawls apparently regards them, I can have no such special claim. On the other hand, if my talents and the fruits of the use I choose to make of them belong to me, then there can be no justified coercion of me if I do not choose to share them with others. The inequalities which Rawls would permit suggest some acquiescence in this view. But those who press this view to its limits will reject the notion that greater equality of income is a legitimate end of public policy. The persistence of such views, especially among the strong and productive, would introduce a fatal instability into a society nominally committed to Rawls' difference principle. It is hardly a secret that different people can have very different religious, moral, and political commitments. In the past, this situation has led to much violence and suffering, as one group has attempted to force its views on others who resisted. In much of the world, such conflicts no longer lead to our killing one another, though there are parts of the world where this still happens. But the fundamental differences haven't gone away. The problem remains of how to construct a political order that can accommodate people with substantially different conceptions of the good, political, moral, and religious. In his book Political Liberalism, Rawls introduces the idea of what he calls public reason. Political reasoning can proceed only on the basis of reasons which are shared among all people and not on the basis of reasons that are peculiar to particular people or traditions. But what if there are no such public reasons? What then? Public reasons seem to hinge upon such values as equality and fairness and freedom, but it might be argued not everyone accepts these values as ultimate. Rawls attempts to evade this objection by arguing that although the justification of such values may differ from group to group, nevertheless all groups can, despite their different justifications of them, adhere to these values. Public reasons then emerge as a kind of neutral area which permits those with very different views to coexist and cohabit. Unfortunately, this would appear to be question-begging. What Rawls is offering us is a no-perspective theory of perspectives, or the idea that neutral values are nobody's values. At the bottom of this is a fundamental circularity. For those who have really strong conceptions of the good, Rawls' public reasons won't count for much. Public reasons are, in fact, just one substantive position among others, and not some neutral zone where all can meet. The notion of public reasons, and also overlapping consensus, simply assumes that there is a common core on which adherents of diverse moral, social, and political doctrines can agree. This depends on one very large presupposition, that each of these different positions has, as it were, a reasonable core, as distinct presumably from the unreasonable outer belt, and that this reasonable core is the same for all. Why should a position have any reasonable core? And even if it did, why should it be the same for all? And who judges what is reasonable? Once again, this is simply a way to gloss over the fact that all positions are positions, All require justification. No one is specially privileged. There are no neutral positions. Public reason is a quasi-substantive moral notion masquerading under a mask of neutrality. David Gordon comments, Rawls's idea of public reason has little to recommend it. Rawls has simply defined a notion of social stability to suit his theory. He never shows that something bad will happen if a society is not stable in his sense. Why cannot a society like our own, with considerable religious and philosophical disagreements, continue to flourish without the crutch of public reason? Unless one defines a society so that it must include common adherence to a political doctrine, it's not clear why social order demands agreement. Would not coercive efforts to enforce such a political orthodoxy on people with strong religious beliefs be likely to reduce social stability rather than promote it? In his book, The Law of Peoples, a late work, Rawls turns his attention to international politics. He distinguishes between what he calls well-ordered people, some of whom are liberal, and other people who are just decent. International order requires us to tolerate decent people, even though they may have state religions and deny people equality of opportunity on religious grounds. If a people is neither liberal nor decent, that is to say it violates human rights or is aggressive, it is an outlaw, and military intervention may be justified. Such people deserve neither respect nor toleration. None of this is revolutionary. In reality, it is just an attempt to rationalize a particular Western perspective on international politics. What is most interesting about The Law of Peoples is that Rawls rejects the claim that his difference principle should be applied globally. David Gordon makes the excellent point that Rawls's attempt to restrict the application of the difference principle within peoples, that is, within nations, states, rather than between or among them, forces him to undermine his own position. Take the example of Butterfly Land and Beehive, two countries that start out with more or less the same level of resources. The inhabitants of Beehive work hard while the feckless inhabitants of Butterfly Land laze the summer away. In time, of course, Beehive is doing quite well, but Butterfly Land is running into trouble. Should some of Beehive's resources be taken to help out the inhabitants of Butterfly Land? Rawls thinks not. Well, why not? Gordon quotes Rawls on this point as saying, surely there is a point at which a people's basic needs, estimated in primary goods, are fulfilled and the people can stand on its own. And asks, why does not an analogous point drastically limit the scope of the difference principle within a society? It cannot be denied that Rawls's work has dominated political philosophy for the last 40 years, nor can it be denied that it is a gallant attempt to promote the marriage of freedom and equality. However, for the reasons I've noted, this arranged Rawlsian marriage is headed for divorce. Summary. John Rawls's A Theory of Justice is generally agreed to have been the seminal work in political philosophy in the second part of the 20th century. A Theory of Justice ignited a veritable firestorm of responses, criticisms, arguments, and counter-arguments, so that its secondary literature is voluminous. A Theory of Justice is an attempt to reconcile the first two legs of the French Revolution's liberty, equality, and fraternity. In Rawls's original position, people have no information about their own individual desires, but do understand politics and economics and psychology. Another central idea of Rawls is reflective equilibrium. The central idea here is that we have first-order judgments about what justice consists in and second-order principles that may or may not justify them. What principles of justice, governing rights and duties and the distribution of goods, would human beings choose behind the veil of ignorance? Rawls believes that the rational choice for all inhabitants of the original position to make is to adopt a kind of maximin strategy, that is, to choose principles of justice that would in some way maximize the position of the least well-off in the resultant society. Rawls comes up with two basic principles of justice, the first one dealing with liberty, the second with equality. the principles are ordered so that the first one takes priority over the second. The first principle of justice is that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. The second principle of justice, the one relating to equality, comes in two parts. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both to the greatest expected benefit of the least advantaged and attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Underlying Rawls' principles is a certain conception of desert which it is important to lay out. Rawls believes that much of what comes to us as a matter of good fortune. We should not benefit from our talents because we have done nothing to deserve them. If everything is a matter of luck, then luck ceases to have any intellectual attraction. Luck as a concept has significance only if it can be contrasted with what is not luck. In enunciating his difference principle, the second principle of justice, Rawls is trying to steer a path between allowing for any distributional outcome consistent with the freedom to own, produce, and contract, on the one hand, and on the other hand, requiring a strictly equal division of all production among the members of a society.